Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. We're here with Bhante Suddhaso this morning, who will be sharing some Dhamma from Anguttara Nikaya 8.6, the Dutiya Loka Dhamma Sutta. And welcome to Kyle, Nancy, Ron, Jayanta, Geeta, Poonam, Michael, Kumu. Everybody ready for Sutta study, it seems. And without further ado, then I'll pass it on to Bhante Suddhaso.
Thank you. So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddhas. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Good morning and good evening. So as mentioned this morning, we'll be looking at a discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya, so chapter 8, sutta number 6, the Dutiya Loka Dhamma Sutta, which is the second of a set of suttas about the worldly conditions. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and give some explanations, and then I'll take any questions at the end. So the sutta begins. This is the Buddha speaking. Monks, these 8 worldly conditions revolve around the world, and the world revolves around these 8 worldly conditions. What 8? Gain, loss, fame, obscurity, blame, praise, pleasure, and pain. Monks, these 8 worldly conditions revolve around the world, and the world revolves around these 8 worldly conditions. So this is introducing the topic of the sutta. So the 8 loka dhammas, the 8 worldly conditions, or 8 worldly phenomena, which in Tibetan Buddhist tradition, they call these the 8 worldly winds. So called because these are things which blow us around. They knock us off balance. But in the Pali tradition, they're simply called the 8 worldly conditions. The 8 worldly phenomena. And they're given as 4 pairs. So 4 pairs of desirable things and undesirable things. So gain and loss. So usually speaking, we want gain, we want to get things, and we don't like to lose things. Fame and obscurity. So we like to be famous and well known, and generally speaking, we don't like it when nobody knows who we are. Some people actually like obscurity. Some people find obscurity soothing and peaceful. In fact, I know a lot of Buddhist monks who their goal in life is obscurity. Ayasoma's giving the thumbs up. I don't believe her. She clearly doesn't want obscurity. Then the next 2, blame and praise. So again, generally speaking, we don't like to be blamed for things. We don't like to be criticized, but we love to be praised. We like it when people praise us and say good things about us. And finally, pleasure and pain. Again, these are quite straightforward, generally speaking. We like pleasure and we dislike pain. We want pleasure and we try to avoid pain. So these are the 8 worldly conditions. And again, I find it interesting here that the Buddha says these 8 worldly conditions revolve around the world, and the world revolves around these 8 worldly conditions. In other words, he's saying that pretty much everyone is obsessed with these 8 worldly conditions. And everything that we do is usually in relationship to these 8 worldly conditions. So trying to acquire and hold on to gain, fame, praise, and pleasure, while trying to avoid or diminish or get rid of loss, obscurity, blame, and pain. So this then is what generates all of our worldly activities, this constant pursuit of the 4 pleasant items and attempt to avoid the 4 unpleasant items. So then the Buddha makes in the next paragraph, the Buddha takes things a bit deeper. He says, monks, gain, loss, fame, obscurity, blame, praise, pleasure, and pain can arise for an uneducated commoner. Monks, gain, loss, fame, obscurity, blame, praise, pleasure, and pain can also arise for an educated disciple of the noble ones. Monks, what is the distinction? What is the difference? What is the variance between the educated disciple of the noble ones and the uneducated commoner? So uneducated commoner is Devadattavipatti, which is one of these delicious Pali terms, especially if you're a hate type, it's a delicious term. So asuttava means one who has not heard the teachings. So this means somebody who doesn't understand the Dhamma, basically. And patujana means common people. So puttu means like broad or wide or common, and jana means generation. It's actually related to the word generate. So patujana is the common people, ordinary people. So patujana is anyone who's not enlightened. They haven't attained any stage of awakening, and they might not even be interested in practicing the path to awakening. So the asuttava patujana is all of your ordinary people who don't know the Dhamma and aren't practicing the Dhamma. And then he sets opposite that the Arya Savaka. So Arya Savaka, Arya means noble, and Savaka literally means listener, but it's usually translated as disciple. So Arya Savaka. There's a couple ways this term can be translated. One is as disciple of the noble ones, as I've translated it here. So somebody who is learning from the awakened beings. And the other is noble disciple. So somebody who has already attained some stage of awakening. And it's never clearly stated in the suttas which meaning is intended. But I tend to lean towards the idea that an Arya Savaka is anybody who is trying to learn from the teachings of the noble ones. So whether you've attained some stage of awakening or not. But again, the Buddha is saying, what's the difference? So whether you're a Buddhist practitioner or not, whether you're awakened or not, then you're going to experience gain and loss. You're going to experience fame and obscurity. You're going to experience blame and praise. You're going to experience pleasure and pain. Everybody experiences these 8 conditions. So what's the difference between someone who's not a Buddhist practitioner and somebody who's made some progress on the path? What's the difference? And the monks reply, Bhante, our teachings are rooted in the Fortunate One, guided by the Fortunate One, based on the Fortunate One. Bhante, it would be good for the Fortunate One to reveal the meaning of this statement. Having heard it from the Fortunate One, the monks will maintain it. So this is a kind of a standard answer. In many suttas, the Buddha will ask a question to the monks, and sometimes the monks will try to answer the question. But on many occasions, they'll reply with this answer. They'll say, wait a minute, you're the Buddha, and you're asking us to explain this? Isn't that kind of backwards? Like, you should be telling us what this means. They do it respectfully, of course. But that's the basic idea is they're like, well, you're the teacher. It would be best for you to explain us what this means. And then we will try to remember it and live according to it. So, and there's a minor interesting point here. So the last line here says, having heard it from the Fortunate One, the monks will maintain it. So the Pali word for maintain is, it's daresanti, so will maintain. So it's in the future tense. From dhareti. So dhareti literally means to hold something. And this is used to mean remember, as in to hold something in your memory. But it also means to uphold something. In other words, to practice in accordance with something, to maintain it, to keep it going in your life. So it has both the sense of remembering something, but also the sense of upholding it. So the monks asked the Buddha to explain what he meant, and the Buddha says, "Therefore, monks, listen and carefully pay attention. I will speak." Yes, Bhante, those monks replied to the Fortunate One, and the Fortunate One said this: "Monks, when gain arises for an uneducated commoner, they do not consider, 'This gain has arisen for me. It is impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change.' They do not accurately understand it." And he says the same for the other ones. So loss, fame, obscurity, blame, praise, pleasure, and pain. For each one of them, he says, when this arises for the uneducated commoner, they do not consider this gain, loss, fame, obscurity, blame, praise, and pleasure, and pain has arisen for me. It is impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change. They do not accurately understand it. And he carries on. He says, their mind is obsessed with gain, obsessed with loss, obsessed with fame, obsessed with obscurity, obsessed with blame, obsessed with praise, obsessed with pleasure, obsessed with pain. Sound familiar to anyone? Maybe reminds you of yourself. Reminds me of myself, anyway. And he says, when gain arises, they approve of it and disapprove of loss. When fame arises, they approve of it and disapprove of obscurity. When praise arises, they approve of it and disapprove of blame. When pleasure arises, they approve of it and disapprove of pain. Since they are so involved in approval and disapproval, they are not freed from birth, decay, dying, sorrow, grief, pain, depression, and anguish. They are not freed from suffering, I say. So this is the way the uneducated commoner, so the ordinary person who's not well practiced in Buddhism, this is how they respond to the 8 worldly conditions. So it's this, they're not recognizing that any condition is impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change. So when you get something nice, when we maybe acquire the newest iPhone, or we get a really nice laptop, or what is it that people like? What is it people try to get?
Money.
Money? Poems?
Phones.
Oh, phones. I just mentioned phones. Okay.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. What's that?
Statues.
Statues.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those have a more wholesome function, though. But I get your point. I get your point. Yeah, I know. It's hard. It's hard. Point being, though, is that ordinarily when we get something that we like, then we think like, oh, I'm going to have this forever. Like this beautiful statue, it's going to be this way forever. But actually, maybe not. Maybe somebody will be cleaning in this room and they'll accidentally knock it over. I don't know how, since it weighs about 500 pounds. But somebody might accidentally knock it over, and then it will shatter and break, and well, that's the end of that. So what's the problem? The problem is that we expected it to be permanent. That's the problem. Its nature was always to be impermanent. Its nature was always that it's subject to change. And also unsatisfying. Things are never quite as good as we might want them to be. They're never quite as enjoyable, never quite as satisfying as we would like. And of course, anything which is impermanent is therefore unsatisfying, because eventually it comes to an end. And it's the same with the rest. So when we experience loss, well, loss is also impermanent. So why are we getting so disturbed? When we experience obscurity or blame or pain, why are we so disturbed and upset? That's also a temporary experience, a temporary condition. And it also is unsatisfying, like everything else. But also the dissatisfaction that arises is because of our own resistance to it. It's because of our own obsession with that unpleasant condition. That's what makes it so painful, is our obsession with it, our wish for things to be different. So all of this, the Buddha says, is not accurately understanding. So by not recognizing the impermanent and unsatisfying nature of phenomena, then that means that we don't clearly understand them. By the way, for those who don't connect with the fame and obscurity thing, so the Pali words here are yasa and ayasa. So yasa can also mean good reputation. So instead of fame and obscurity, you could also translate that as good reputation and bad reputation. So maybe you want obscurity, but nobody wants to have a bad reputation. So that might help out for those of you who crave obscurity. Because actually, if you have obscurity, then you don't have a bad reputation because you don't have any reputation at all. And I find it very interesting here. So the Buddha says, again, when we get the pleasant conditions, then we approve of them. And when we get the unpleasant conditions, we disapprove of them. And the Buddha says, when one is so involved in approval and disapproval, then one is not freed from birth, decay, dying, sorrow, grief, pain, depression, and anguish. They're not freed from suffering. In other words, as long as we're constantly involved with approving of some parts of samsara and disapproving of other parts, then that means we're completely wrapped up in samsara. We're still being pushed around by the shifting conditions of the world. We're being controlled by external conditions. We're being controlled by conditions that are outside of our own direct control. So this means that we're constantly being battered around. We're constantly being dominated by the shifting conditions of life. So our happiness is not under our own control. We're happy when we get the pleasant conditions, and we're unhappy when we get the unpleasant conditions. But we can't control those things. So that means our happiness and unhappiness is controlled by external conditions. And this is why he says one who is involved in approval and disapproval is not freed from suffering. Because our happiness is dependent upon things that are outside of our control. Then he gives the flip side of this, which is the educated disciple of the noble ones, so the one who knows the Dhamma and is practicing the Dhamma. He says, monks, when gain, loss, fame, obscurity, blame, praise, pleasure, and pain arise, for an educated disciple of the noble ones, they consider, this gain, loss, fame, obscurity, blame, praise, pleasure, and pain has arisen for me. It is impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change. They accurately understand it. So for those who are familiar with Pali, the word that's translated here as accurately is yatha bhuta. Yatha bhuta literally means as it has come to be, or as it is. And it says, their mind is not obsessed with gain, not obsessed with loss, not obsessed with fame, not obsessed with obscurity, not obsessed with blame, not obsessed with praise, not obsessed with pleasure, not obsessed with pain. When gain arises, they do not approve of it and they do not disapprove of loss. When fame arises, they do not approve of it and they do not disapprove of obscurity. When praise arises, they do not approve of it and they do not disapprove of blame. When pleasure arises, they do not approve of it and they do not disapprove of pain. Since they have abandoned approval and disapproval, they are freed from birth, decay, dying, sorrow, grief, pain, depression, and anguish. They are freed from suffering, I say. Monks, this is the distinction, the difference, the variance between the educated disciple of the noble ones and the uneducated commoner. So here he's giving, again, the positive formulation. So when one is practicing properly, then one is recognizing that gain, fame, praise, and pleasure are temporary conditions. They're impermanent, they're unsatisfying, they're subject to change. So when those conditions arise, one doesn't get elated, one doesn't get obsessed, one isn't fixated on them. One doesn't get excited at all because you recognize, oh, this is just another shift in the shifting conditions of life. It's nothing to get excited about because it doesn't have anything to do with awakening. It doesn't have anything to do with true happiness. It's just another shift in the world. It's just the winds changing directions, that's all. It's just a change in the weather. So when it gets a little bit warmer or a little bit colder, well, that's just the weather. Why would we make a big deal about that? Well, it's the same. So you get a little more praise or a little more blame. Well, that's just the weather. That's just the weather of the world. So I've been a monk for many, many years now, and I've been involved in the public domain for many, many years now. And sometimes I get a little more praise, and sometimes I get a little more criticism. Sometimes I have a bit better reputation, and sometimes a bit worse reputation. Well, that's just the shifting weather. That's just the shifting weather of worldly conditions. And also reflecting on one's own life, one can think, well, sometimes I have a bit more wealth or a bit less wealth. Sometimes people like me a bit more or like me a bit less. Well, that's just the shifting weather of life. It's nothing to be excited by, and it's nothing to be disturbed by, because ultimately it's completely irrelevant to the cultivation of wisdom and compassion. It doesn't have anything whatsoever to do with anything meaningful. So one who is well established on the Buddhist path is not bothered by these 8 worldly conditions. They're not either, they're not obsessed with the pleasant ones, and they're not disturbed by the unpleasant ones. They just recognize it as the shifting weather patterns of life. So this also is connected to equanimity. So yesterday, somebody had asked about equanimity. So this is one way of describing equanimity. It's when we recognize that gain, loss, fame, obscurity, blame, praise, pleasure, and pain. We recognize that all these things are impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change. They're just the shifting weather patterns of life. So we don't get excited. We don't get obsessed. We don't get disturbed. We just watch as the colors and patterns of life shift and flow. But we don't make a big deal about any of it. Whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, we don't make a big deal about it. Instead, constantly turning attention towards the recognition of impermanence. So that's the critical point that the Buddha is making here, is to constantly focus on the impermanent nature of all of these conditions, of all of these experiences. And recognizing that these conditions cannot be used as a basis for happiness because they are unreliable. They're not something that we can rely upon for any kind of true, lasting happiness and serenity. So then the Buddha ends with a short poem. So as with many of the short discourses from the Anguttara Nikaya and the Samyutta Nikaya, this one ends with a short poem. So it says, and by the way, in translating this, I made no effort whatsoever to maintain the poetic quality of the original. So if you like poetry, then you're just going to have to learn Pali, because that's the only way to get the poetic flavor of these verses. So the Buddha says, gain, loss, fame, and obscurity, blame, praise, pleasure, and pain. Among humans, these things are impermanent, not eternal. They are subject to change. One who is mindful and wise knows this and sees that they are subject to change. The mind is not disturbed by desirable things, nor is it repelled by the undesirable. One for whom approval and disapproval have dissipated, vanished, and do not exist, who has known the path, stainless and sorrowless, rightly understands, for they have transcended existence. This is the end of the sutta. So this beautiful little poem. There's a couple minor things I'd like to point out about this. First off, he says, the mind is not disturbed by desirable things. I find this a very interesting statement, because normally we think of desirable things as wonderful and pleasant and enjoyable. But the Buddha is actually pointing out the fact that when we are prone to desire and attachment, then experiencing desirable things is disturbing to the mind. It agitates the mind. So we think that excitement is pleasant, but excitement is just another form of agitation. So this also calls to mind one of my favorite quotes from the Rattapala Sutta. So in the Rattapala Sutta, so Rattapala was a young man from a wealthy family who decided to become a monk. And many people found this very puzzling. They were like, why did you give up such a wonderful, pleasant life in order to be a penniless renunciant? And so at one point, a king is asking Rattapala why he became a monk. And Rattapala gives this long, beautiful explanation of why he became a monk. And one of the lines from that explanation, Rattapala says, sensual pleasure, varied, sweet, delightful, in many different ways disturbs the mind. So similar to this statement here, it's pointing out the fact that, yeah, there are lots of really wonderful, lovely, pleasant things in the world. And if our mind is not stable and pure, then we will be disturbed by those things. It disrupts our serenity of mind. It disrupts our peace of mind. It disrupts our happiness. So we think that getting pleasant experiences makes us happy, but it's actually the opposite. If we're constantly being knocked around by pleasure and pain, then the mind is far from happiness. It's far from serenity. The couple other important things to point out here again, by the way, it points out sorrowless. So last night we talked about sorrowlessness. So here again, the Buddha is emphasizing that one who knows the path, so one who knows the path of Buddhist practice, can eventually become immune to sorrow. So not subject to the state of sadness. And also he says that one who rightly understands transcends existence. So in other words, they're not caught in any particular state of being. They're not stuck in any particular condition in the world. So that's my thoughts on this sutta. So I think I'll go ahead and end there, and then we can switch to discussion.
Hannamayam Dhammakataya Sadhukaram Nadamase Sadhu 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 Anumodami. Thank you, Bhante. As Anita says, thank you for this beautiful Dhamma talk. And hello to some other friends that have joined us in the meanwhile. Hello to Amaranta and Anita, of course, Ishanti, Sakita, Mint, Elaine, Amir from UK. Great, wonderful. Hello, Frederick, Metta, and a lot of other friends. Stuart, B, this morning, everybody's online. Great. Putrika and so forth. So Gita asks, Bhante Suddhaso, if one develops nibbida as a daily practice, would this help one to develop and advance in the path?
Absolutely. Yeah, so nibbida, which I like to translate as disenchantment. That was one of Bhikkhu Bodhi's words, which he commonly uses to translate this word. So nibbida, disenchantment. Literally, it means not seeking. So it comes from the word vindati, which means to seek for something or to try to find something. So nibbindati is the prefix nir means down. So nibbindati is you've put down your search. You've stopped seeking. You stop seeking for happiness in worldly conditions. So nibbida is when, again, you've lost your enchantment with the world. You started to recognize that worldly conditions can never bring you true happiness. That even the most pleasant experiences are ultimately temporary and unsatisfying. So since you recognize that worldly experiences are unsatisfying, then you start to lose your taste for them. They no longer have the savor that they used to. So for people who are not into Buddhist practice, then this usually leads to depression. Those who are into Buddhist practice, this leads to serenity. Because we recognize that since the search for worldly pleasure is futile, then we stop. And when we stop, then we realize that peace and happiness was already within our grasp, and always has been within our grasp. And it was the constant search that was preventing us from being happy in the first place. Yeah, it's the terrible irony that seeking happiness is what prevents us from being happy. So yeah, practice disenchantment. Recognize the paltry and unsatisfying nature of worldly pleasures, and yeah, you'll start to discover the deeper rewards of the Buddhist path. Yeah, the Buddha says, Nibindang virajati viraga vimuchati. This is another of my favorite lines from the suttas that appears in many, many places. Disenchantment causes dispassion. Dispassion causes liberation. So nibindang virajati. So disenchantment, dispassions, causes dispassion. Viraga vimuchati. Dispassion liberates. Okay. Any other questions?
Question about the statement which came up in this discourse, and many, it's like, as the Buddha says, so we'll remember it, the dareti. And I'm just curious if you have any experience or thoughts on, it's not like the Buddha would say 5 words and then the monks would be like, okay, wait, let me just embed that in their mind. The Buddha would say this whole long thing, so one would think that the monks at that time would have had structures in place for receiving teachings spontaneously and being able to embed them in real time, which is something which I certainly didn't learn in school. But I'm curious if you've learned any such techniques, or if you know of any which maybe you haven't tried, but which you think might help with that immediate encoding of new information so that it goes into long-term memory.
I haven't, but what comes to mind is when Bhante Sumitra was here, we were talking with him because commonly in Sri Lanka, when monks are novices, they're required to memorize, at a bare minimum, they're required to memorize the Dhammapada. And usually they memorize way more than that. And what he said is that in the very beginning, it's often challenging, but after a little while, you get to a point where you just hear a verse and you can remember it automatically. There's something about when you're training the mind to memorize things, if you even see it or hear it once, if you have the intent to memorize it, then you will. So he said in the beginning, he would have to constantly go over a verse in order to memorize it. But then as time went by, he got to a point where he would just read a line from the Dhammapada and it would be memorized. He didn't have to repeat it in order to imprint it on his mind. So my understanding is that the ability to memorize things is a skill which we've mostly lost these days because we don't really need to memorize things. So we don't really bother to train our ability of memorizing until we become adults and wind up in monasteries where we're expected to memorize dozens of pages of chanting, and we're like, wait, what? Memorize? Repeat it without reading it? Are you sure? And then in our 20s, 30s, 40s, then suddenly we have to develop a skill that we've never really developed. I couldn't even memorize the times tables when I was a kid. And I didn't even bother to try, to be perfectly honest. I just learned math, but I didn't memorize charts.
What do you think is the relationship between that and present moment mindfulness? Because if the monks at the time of the Buddha had that skill, of being able to memorize long things, that is another definition for sati. And do you think it might, cultivating those memory skills might help one's present moment mindfulness?
Well, I think there definitely is a connection, because in order to remember something, you have to be fully aware of it when it's happening. So if you're not paying attention when something is happening, then you definitely won't be able to remember it. So yes, in order to memorize something, you have to be paying attention in the first place. And by the way, the other thought that comes to mind also is that usually the Buddha was delivering discourses to groups of people. So actually, I suspect if he's talking to 10 people, then afterwards, those 10 people would get together and they would try to recite what the Buddha said. And they would be making mistakes and correcting each other until by the end of it, all 10 of them were on the same page and they all had basically the same version, which was a near precise match for what the Buddha had said, or possibly an exact match of what the Buddha had said. So I think that's also part of what produced it, is that maybe not everyone had a perfect memorization, but enough people were doing it that they would get it. But I do also think there were many people who could, as Bhante Sumita was saying, they just hear it once, but they're not listening in kind of the half-hearted way that we normally listen to things. But they're like laser focused, really precisely devoting all their attention to catching every single syllable and imprinting it in their mind the moment they hear it. So it's a very active, focused, intent state of mind, as opposed to the kind of like, okay, the Dhamma talk is almost over, almost over, almost over, like the kind of spacey way.
They're present while they're listening, and then when it's done, they get back together and then reinforce that memory.
Yeah.
Talking to each other about it.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So yeah, I also think that does foster the quality of mindfulness and attention. Because it's actually quite noticeable. If you space out, then you miss a phrase, and then later on you're trying to remember and you're like, oh, there's blank spots in my memory because I wasn't paying attention. Yeah.
It's not terribly different than instant translators these days. So it's more the medium that changes, in my opinion. Like that back then, since there was no kind of typing instrument where you're writing, it was just more, it's the oral tradition. But yeah, I agree. There has to be both sort of the culture for learning and then the habit. When I was a little child, for example, in primary school, we had to learn by heart poetry. So it was very easy for me to retain, like my memory was really good when I was in primary school. But as technology advanced, these things became obsolete. And these days, I have a very hard time actually memorizing things, holding things, like memorizing the suttas in Pali, for example. But even say Latin, or my parents, who are significantly older than I am, have actually a better memory than I do. So it does come with training.
Right. It's worth pointing out that even these days there are people who memorize the entire Pali Canon.
Yeah.
There's not very many anymore, because people think, oh well, but we've got it all on the internet. Why would I bother to memorize these things when I can just look it up whenever I want? But there's still people who keep up that old skill, and it's just mind-blowing, like memorizing thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pages of Pali texts and then reciting it flawlessly. So there's still people who do these things.
Yeah, because there's the tradition to do it.
Yeah.
And Bhante Nancy asks, do you have a suggestion for trying to let go of the craving for praise?
Well, I have to admit that I actually have a bit of a problem with this one myself, because it is actually really nice to be praised, isn't it? It's actually very enjoyable. But also recognizing how quickly it flips around. It's like, oh, it's so lovely to be praised. And then the person is like, yeah, but that thing you said yesterday, that was totally inappropriate. And then mine flips and it's like, wait, what? Where did that pleasure of being praised go? Now I'm in this discomfort of somebody pointing out my faults, whether they're correct or not. There's that discomfort that comes. So as the Buddha says, recognizing that it's impermanent. Yeah, right now somebody is praising you, and that's nice. But you don't just go through your entire life being constantly praised. And if you did, it would actually get old after a while. Like, I don't know if you would like have your earbuds in that are constantly on a repeat track, like "You're so great, you're so great, you're so great." Eventually, it just becomes meaningless background noise. It loses its flavor. So, as the Buddha says, recognizing that praise, like everything else, praise is it's temporary, it's conditional. Under certain circumstances, you'll get praised, and other circumstances, you won't get praised. And therefore, it's not a reliable basis of happiness. But another thing that's really useful to keep in mind, by the way, is that the person praising you is probably delusional. So that means their praise is not trustworthy. Now, if you're getting praised by a Buddha, that's a different story. Then you can rely on it. But anybody who's not enlightened, their praise is not trustworthy. They don't know what the heck they're talking about. They're just advertising their own defilements. That's all they're doing. But they're advertising their defilements in a way that's pleasant to you. But that doesn't change the fact that it's unreliable. It's not trustworthy information. Of course, and the other thing also is to ask yourself, is this experience of being praised, is it actually doing me any good? Is it actually bringing me any closer to awakening? And the answer is going to be usually no. The one exception that comes to mind is if somebody is praising your wholesome activities, which then encourages you to be even more committed to wholesome activities. So the positive reinforcement, that can be quite helpful. So for example, you finish reading in the Buddha's words and someone is like, "Oh, well done, that was so wonderful." Then you feel good. It's like, yes, I read a bunch of suttas. And the praise then strengthens your appreciation for the wholesome activity that you've done. And that makes you even more inspired to read more suttas and do more wholesome things. So that's actually useful. But if somebody is praising you for exterminating a bunch of ants, well, that's not doing you any good. Or if somebody is praising you for getting the high score in a video game, well, I mean, okay, congratulations, I guess. I mean, doesn't get you one step closer to enlightenment. So yeah, recognize that the person praising you probably doesn't have any clue. They're just voicing their own delusions and defilements.
All right, thank you, Bhante. And Shraddha asks, even though we can see things as impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change, oftentimes they are still approving or disapproving.
Mm-hmm.
For example, wanting pain to end faster. Is it due to lack of proper understanding?
Yeah. So in those circumstances, it's because we're not looking closely at the experience. For example, pain. When you look closely at the experience of pain, then it actually stops hurting. The painfulness of pain is because we aren't clearly observing what's happening. So it is because of a lack of wise understanding, a lack of wise attention. And the craving for the pain to end is missing out on the fact that no matter what you want the future to be, your present experience is still exactly what it is. So if your present experience is pain, it doesn't matter how much you want the pain to end, it doesn't change the fact that your present experience is pain. So ultimately, you need to come to grips with the fact that your present experience is exactly what it is. And technically speaking, it is impossible to change the present moment. You can create conditions which shift the future, but the present moment is the consequence of the past. And you can't change the past. So one way of looking at things is that your present moment experience is completely out of your control. The only thing you can change is your reaction to the present moment. That's the only thing you can change. So right now there's pain happening. Well, okay, look at it, pay attention to it, examine it. Examine it with a mind of equanimity, a mind of acceptance, a mind of curiosity. And then the pain will disappear. There will still be a sensation, but it will no longer register as pain.
question. Talk about like mindfulness of the body.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or techniques for, say, if you are praised and you feel like the upwelling of energy to like be delighted in it. If there are any ways to focus like intention inside the body, focus mind inside the body to counteract that welling up. Like Ajahn Jeff says that if someone says something which you think is like really funny, but which is inappropriate to laugh at, if you just focus attention like down really low in the body, then that can like quell that kind of inappropriate laughter. So like similarly with like praise, have you experimented with that?
That's interesting. I've never thought about it in those terms. So I'd have to experiment with that. I don't know. How about you? Do you have any experience with using that method?
I don't, but it seems like it could be a good idea. I mean, like anything, it really is a welling up. Like if you're praised, and regardless of whether it's true or false to some extent, like there's this wanting to get excited about it, but that's not always the best thing.
What I do find is that just generally speaking, coming back to mindfulness of the body tends to cut through any kind of excitement or disturbance. So whatever the source is, whether it's praise or whether it's pleasure or whether it's anything, just coming back to the experience of the body. So the feeling of your feet against the ground, the feeling of your lungs expanding and contracting, and the feeling of your clothing against your skin, of the wind, like just this physical body right here, this heavy, solid, weighty mass right here. And then everything else, it's just a bunch of abstraction. So somebody is saying words, well, what is that? Well, it's just wind. There's some slight vibration in your ear. And then we assign abstract meaning to the abstract words, and then from that we generate this abstract idea that we're supposed to be happy because of what they were saying. But all of that is completely irrelevant to this solid mass of flesh and blood and bone. So I found this effective, actually both when hearing desirable statements and also undesirable things. Just coming back to the body, and it's just like, oh, just puts everything into perspective. It's like, it's just abstractions. It has no relevance whatsoever to this meaty chunk of blood here. Bloody chunk of meat, I think, would make more sense. Okay.
All right, and Piyal asks, what is the difference between Srutavat, Arya Savaka, and Attapurusa Puggala, parenthesis, Sarvaka Sangha? I guess, is this like a little bit more Sanskrit?
Yeah, that's the Sanskrit spelling. Can you say it again slowly and clearly?
Srutavat, Arya Savaka, so Arya Savaka.
Srutava Arya Savaka.
And Attapurusa Puggala.
Oh, Attapurisa Puggala. So the Attapurisa Puggala, that's from the recollection of the Sangha. So the 8 kinds of people. And that's referring to the 4 stages of awakening and the 4 people on the path to those 4 stages of awakening. So the Suttava Arya Savaka would include all of those 8 kinds of people. So the person on the path to the first stage of awakening, the person on the first stage of awakening, all the way up to full enlightenment. So the eight kinds of people. Yeah, the thing is that there's this gray zone of debate between like the complete non-spiritual worldling, completely uninterested in Buddhist practice, and the person on the path to stream entry. There's this kind of gray zone in between, which is not clearly classified. And even defining the person on the path to stream entry, there's a lot of debate about just what that means. At what point can you say someone is on the path to stream entry? So there's debate around these points. So I'm not really sure what to tell you beyond that. So it's getting into one of these gray zones where scholars like to argue and practitioners like to stop arguing and practice. Yes, I wouldn't worry about it too much because ultimately it doesn't really matter. The important thing, once again, is learning the suttas and living the Dhamma. That's what matters.
Great, thank you, Bhante. And Kumu says, passionate about seeking serenity, passionate about being dispassionate.
Sounds great. Yeah, keep it up. That's the good kind of passion.
And Charles Lee says, I used to have many phone numbers memorized. Now I only know mine, my partner's, and the one I grew up with, which my parents gave up years ago. Yeah, and the different technology affects us in a different way.
That's pretty good. I can only remember my own number at this point.
Anita says, Bhante, any suggestion for obscurity fame? I think you already covered that, actually, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Kumu says, I think Pythagora and Buddha lived during the same time period. Maybe even they in Greece did a lot of memorizing. Yes, absolutely. The oral tradition was worldwide.
Yeah.
Michael says, a wonderful sutta, direct and powerful. I share this praise thing. I'm bemused by all my cravings. The worst is, you look so young. You're so intelligent. All right. And let's see, there's a lot of chatting between our friends, which is great. Nawal says, Bhante, we can't change the past, but wouldn't certain actions in present moment change the future pain in worldly context, or should we just let go?
Well, you have to be practical. So ultimately, you don't want to cause lasting damage to your body because your body is actually quite helpful. It's a useful tool, and you want to keep it in good condition. So, for example, if you a chainsaw is a very useful tool, but if you leave it out in the rain for a few days, then it will very quickly stop being a useful tool. And then when you need to go and cut a log, then, well, your chainsaw is not going to work very well or possibly at all. So on the other hand, if you take good care of your chainsaw, then it will last for many, many years. So it's the same with your body. If you are neglectful of your body, then it can become damaged. And when it's damaged, it's actually quite an obstruction to your practice. And it's not so easy to practice when your health is very bad. Or if you have broken limbs, or if you're in the hospital, like it gets quite difficult. So being relatively healthy is a support to one's practice. The Buddha says this in many suttas, actually, that being relatively healthy helps you to practice well. So you want to avoid damaging your body if you can. Be practical. In the Subbasava Sutta, one of the categories is about avoiding physically harmful situations. So the Buddha is talking about how one of the ways that we reduce our defilements is by avoiding situations which might injure our bodies, which is very interesting. He doesn't say, oh, just practice equanimity. He actually says, stay away from dangerous wild animals, stay away from dangerous terrain, stay away from harmful friendships that might boost your defilements. The Buddha doesn't say walk blithely into dangerous situations with equanimity. No, he says stay away from dangerous situations. So we need to be practical. And that also means with our body. So if the pain that's happening is a sign that there's actually physical damage happening, then you should do something about it. You shouldn't just press through it. I met a few people over the years who tried to just press through serious pain, and they wound up injuring themselves, in some cases causing long-lasting injuries. But at the same time, we do need to develop equanimity and the ability to tolerate and endure physical sensations. So if it's not genuine damage happening to the body, then yeah, you should stick with it. You should practice equanimity, mindfulness and equanimity. Rather than just constantly trying to avoid pain all the time. And when you are experiencing pain and there's nothing you can do about it, then you'll be grateful that you've developed the ability to peacefully endure pain. You'll be happy that you can face those situations with composure and dignity. Okay. Any other questions?
Great, thank you, Bhante. I think that is the last one, it seems. And Gita is saying, I'm in retreat with Bhante Body this weekend, Friday evening to Monday at noon, so I will not be able to join tonight. Well, you can think about Ajahn Kavial. He will also be on retreat with you, because he's going exactly there to stay with Venerable Bhikkhu Body until the Vasa starts. So that's all for this evening. For those of you who want to join Venerable Bhikkhu Body's retreat for the weekend, you can go on the BAUS website. It's BAUS, I believe, .org. Is that correct? Let me check. Yes, I got it right. BAUS.org. And if instead you have lingering questions and would like to ask them to a panel of monastics, you can do so by connecting to Monk Chat this evening, where myself, Bhante Suddhaso, and Tan Gang, our new guest monk, will be here answering your questions. So that is at 7:30 p.m. New York City time. And if you're around the monastery this weekend, tomorrow and Saturday we'll have meditation on the lawn at 6 p.m. as usual. And on July 4th, we will be celebrating Interdependence Day. So you can come for the day here at the monastery and share some food with other practitioners, and then we'll be doing some walking meditation, some other activities, and you're welcome to bring your kids. All right, so we can end the morning with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
May you all be happy and peaceful.